I'm going to present the subject on psychological counseling. My name is Michael Mulondo, psychological counseling degree, second year. The code is PC20D2. We're going to cover the following aspects on psychological counseling too. We're going to look at the fundamental of psychology, and then also how does psychology affect sex. We're going to look at the fundamentals of the modern psychological counseling principles and practices. We're going to look at the aspects of ethics, and then also what codes and practices are there that can guide a counselor and also your counseling session. And then we're going to look at the different modern HIV counseling intervention, and then also some guidelines. Then we're going to look at specific needs for counseling needs for people, specific groups like children, sex workers, rape victims, survivors, adolescents, and so on. And then we're going to end the session with the awareness creation among the community. Now, it's very important to know that when we look at psychology and we look at sex, especially psychological counseling, and for this module, psychological counseling is focused on people that are infected and affected for HIV/AIDS. Now, in sub-Saharan Africa, that HIV is transmitted mostly by sex or sexual practices, and it's very important for this module specifically to look at how does sex and sexuality influence the spread of HIV/AIDS. And when you are going to have a session with a client or people where you take them through psychological counseling, the aspects in sex and sexuality is very important because that is having a direct impact on the spread of HIV/AIDS. So it's very important to understand that as a psychological counselor, you have to understand the aspects of psychology and sex and how that's very important, especially when it comes to sex education and looking at preventional methods like abstinence, be faithfulness, condom, and other preventional mechanism that you can follow. So it's very important when you look at the fundamentals of psychology and sex that you have to understand this fundamental. You have to look at the history of man, and you have to look at certain cultural practices that actually influence sex and sexuality among humanity. Because as a counselor and as a psychological counselor, when you are dealing with clients, you have to have an understanding is what makes certain culture, or what are the certain cultural practices, looking from ancient up to modern practices when it comes to sex and sexuality, and the basic human behavior and how humans are behaving when it comes to their sexuality. So it's so important that you have to look at the whole social construction, society. Why do society perceive sex and sexuality in a certain way? Why do they practice sex and sexuality in a certain way? And their behavior. What are the taboos? What are the beliefs? What are the norms when it comes to sexuality? And how does that then link to the behavior that can actually put people at risk to be infected with HIV/AIDS? So there are various cultures, and this in this module we're going to look at those different aspects which are actually influencing. So as I said earlier, is HIV/AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa is mostly transmitted through sex and sexual practice, and it's very important for you to understand sex in different cultures. Now, there is a difference between sex and sexuality. People are how they express themselves is in their sexuality as a man or as a woman can be or might be influenced by different factors like culture, those norms, practice, society, religion. So many aspects or factors can influence. And for you, it's very important to look at there are different kinds of sexuality, of expressions of sex. And it's very important as a psychological counselor that you have to have an understanding. So I'm going to look at the different elements of sex and sexuality. The first one is sex in a relationship. You have heterosex, which means it's sex between men and women, male and female. And then you've got same sex, which is sex between men and woman and woman. So those are the different aspects or elements of sexuality that you find in a relationship. And then you also have another element where you have sex and religion. Different religion practice sex differently. They see sex differently. Their perception of sex is totally different. And you, as a psychological counselor, you need to understand sex and how religion is influencing sex or sexual practices among human. And then the other one is element you have to have an understanding is sex and politics, because sex is all about power. And politics is all about power. How do people use their power to enforce their sexuality on other people? Policies, for an example. The other one is sex and technology, the internet. Everyone is having access to internet, watching pornography. The question is, how does technology or pornography influence people's sexual behavior? And what makes people, because of curiosity, want to apply their sexual practices because of what technology is giving them? Sexual instruments, so many toys they are having. And so technology is influence, the media is influence our sexual behavior, and it's very important for you to understand that. And pederasty or pedagogic friendship, two people that are starting to date as from adolescence all the way becoming youth and then young adults, and then of course end up staying together or marrying. So you have to understand sexuality and sex within young people from a very early stage. The other thing is sexual preferences, zoosexuality. People are having sex with animals. People are having sex with toys, for an example. So these are the different aspects that you have to understand. And then, of course, the other fundamentals, the other aspect, element that you have to look at sex and sexuality is sex works or prostitution. How does that affect or infect people's sexuality? That you can sell sex, for an example, you can give sex as a service. And as I say, the whole idea of this module is to see how does sex and sexuality actually affect the spread of HIV/AIDS among us, the community. So it's very important for you to have all those. Now, we are going to look now at the modern psychological counseling practices. And as I said, important that counseling is a very important element. It's a process. You have to focus on the client, what the client wants. You have to look at what support you can give to this client and how you can help. Because counseling is a process of therapy. You are giving, it's a therapeutical services that you're actually giving. And this client must feel better. You don't need to solve the problem of that client, but just the fact for that client to go through the process of counseling will help the client to feel much better and to cope with his or her situation. So it's very important, that when you are practicing counseling, you have to view counseling in the view of culture, religion, and gender. And as I said earlier, when it comes to sex and sexuality, there are cultural, religious, and then also gender practices. And of course, HIV/AIDS as a sickness or as a disease cannot be a standalone entity. You have to bring it together in a holistic manner with all these practices. And you as a psychological counselor, you have to make sure that culture, religion, and gender does influence the behavior of people and how they react and how they behave, whether their behavior is risky or not risky. So it's very important as a psychological counseling to look into that. Now, as a psychological counseling, it's very important that you have to make sure that you have a certain ethical principle. Ethics, it's very important. You have to adhere to those ethical principles, and there are certain issues that you have to look at. And when you are as a counselor, is the client needs to have a sense that you can be trusted, because the moment a client walks into your office, the client must have a sense of trust, a sense of self-worth. The environment that you are creating must give the client a sense of safety, and it's very important. And one of the ways to give that sense of safety to a client is if you apply ethical principles. Ethical principles, for an example, like sensitivity. So we're quickly going to look through the different principles. The first one is autonomy. When a client comes in, a client must know that he or she can make independent decision, and that self-determination for client is very important, and you have to create that conducive environment for the client to come in, to know that he or she has the right to make a decision or not to make a decision. Non-maleficence is very important, that the client must know that there is no harm. The most sad or difficult situation, most the heartfelt situation is when a client comes in, and when the clients leave that office, then the client is worse off than when she or he comes into your office. So it's very important to make sure that the client does not feel that her privacy or his privacy is actually violated, and harm is very important, that you have to avoid harm. Beneficence, it's very important. Wellness, the client must feel healthy about him or herself, that sense of well-being, that sense of wholeness, because counseling is actually a journey of wholeness. It's a journey that you have to work with the client, and the client needs to know that he or she needs to feel better about himself or herself, and this is where you have to apply the principle of beneficence. Other one is justice. The client must know that his or her rights is respected. And it's very important that when you are dealing with a client, that sense of commitment must be there. The client must know that you are there for him or for her. You have to avoid biasness and also discriminating. Just the fact that the client comes in and you disagree with the client's view of his or her sexuality, for an example, or his view about how he sees his behavior, you as a counselor, it's not your place to judge. It is your place just to listen, because you are there to facilitate, to guide the client to make the right decision. So it's very important that justice is very important. You have to make sure that you apply that. Then, of course, fidelity is the honesty is very important. The client must not feel that you are there to deceive him or her, that you are exploiting the client. The client must know that you are honest, and you put your money where your mouth is. You don't just give empty promises. And it's very important as a counselor, and this is normally what I find the mistakes that most counselors are doing, is when a client come in and then when the client even before the client starts to speak, then you make these empty promises. It is not your place to make any empty promises. That's why I say one of the greatest asset of a counselor is listening skill. Create those listening skills where you listen to a client and know this is the problem of the client, so that at the end of the day, when the decision is made mostly by the client, then it's a consensual decision, and the client is at peace by making those decisions. Now, there are certain codes and practices which actually guide counseling, and UNAIDS and World Health Organization have given a certain recommendation that needs to be followed, and it's very important to follow this recommendation. The first one is you need to have a counseling policy. You need to have a policy as a guideline that can help the organization or the entity to make the right decision, especially when it comes to counseling. And these policies needs to be in line to the public health legislation of the country. And it's so important that it's not just about counseling. You have to know that there are legal aspects involved when it comes to counseling. The other recommendation given is then you need to have a broader consultation. Stakeholders need to be consulted. It's not just a one-man show. You have to make sure that whenever you are having a policy or a guideline on psychological counseling, you have to involve the community. You have to involve the gatekeepers, which means the community leaders. You have to engage also other service providers, so that when you have this policy in place, it is through broad and everyone is having ownership on this policies. Then training is very important. Ongoing training that you have to apply or you have to give and to your counselors, and it's very important to make sure that you provide this ongoing training and capacity building for the counselors because of new trends when it comes to counseling. Then ethical codes are very important. Professionalism, very important. We talk about that earlier in my earlier slides. When we talk about ethics, you have to make sure, and WHO UNAIDS recommend that you need to have professional ethical codes. Mechanism of accountability. You are not just responsible to your clients, but you are also accountable to the superiors, or also to the policies when it of psychological counseling, and you have to make sure that you need to have a sense of responsibility when it comes to the client. It's very important that you need to make sure that you are there as a support to the client. You have to create that mechanism to make sure that you give support to vulnerable people, especially people that went through a very traumatic experience. That support service needs to be there, and that's one of the recommendations that WHO is giving. And of course, what UNAIDS and WHO also recommend is you have to have the community at heart. Psychological counseling is at the heart of the community. Are you going to create peer counselors, peer educators as part of the psychological counseling? And you have to make sure that you have the community at heart and community project. So these are the recommendations by the World Health Organization. There are other modern counseling intervention that you can also apply. There are 4 currently, so I'm quickly going to go through them. The first one is volunteer counseling and testing, where a client come in voluntary for testing, and before the testing the client will get counseling, and then after the test, then when the results is going to be then given to the client will also get counseling. So those are what we call the volunteer counseling and testing, which are modern practices, or which are practices which are applied today. The other one is provider initiated counseling and testing, where you as a provider, you actually initiate. The client does not come to you, but you actually go to a company, or you go to your employee, or you go to the community and you give the services. And that's mostly where you have mobile clinics, and you go with your mobile services, you initiate those counseling. And then the third one is couple HIV testing, where husband and a wife, boyfriend and girlfriend comes together. They decide as a couple they will go together for HIV testing and for counseling. And then prevention for positive, those people that are HIV positive, very important that they have to know and to have an understanding that when you are HIV positive, and to avoid reinfection, you also need counseling, because people that are on ARV think that the moment that they are on ARV, they are immune for reinfection. And it's very fatal. It's very important that you know that when you are on ARV and you are HIV positive, you need to prevent reinfection. And this is the whole purpose of this counseling. It's looking at prevention with positives. Now, there are certain guidelines that you have to look at, which are very important. and these guidelines needs to be adhered to. So there are many other guidelines, but these are basic guidelines which are actually can help you as a counseling. The first one is it's very important to know that the counseling is voluntary. You as a counseling, you are volunteering to help people. A client that comes voluntary, also by his own volition, comes to you, own will comes to you for help. And then it's very important to adhere to confidentiality, because the client needs to know that that he or she can trust you as a counselor. So that confidentiality is very important, and of course anonymity. The client needs to know that he or she, privacy and identity will be protected. So it's very important that when you have this counseling session, that the client needs to be anonymous. His or her privacy needs to be protected as much as possible. And then, of course, as I said earlier, with volunteer counseling and testing, is you have the aspect of pre and post test counseling, which also needs to be emphasized, especially when somebody comes in for HIV testing, that before you conduct the test, you have to counsel that person, and we call that pre, which means before the testing. And then you conduct the test where you draw the blood, and then you have, after the results has been known, then you will take the client through a counseling which we call the post-test counseling, where you then take the client through a process of dealing with telling him or her what her status or his status is through that counseling. And then, of course, the results, when you have to give the results face to face, because you can't give the result of the HIV results through a telephone or via email. So counseling is very important. That face to face scenario is very important. And of course, as I said, confidentiality needs to be protected. Human rights, or the right of the client, needs to be respected. And then it's very important that you need to adhere to a situation where you need to apply some leadership, and even lead the person to the right moment, right way, to make the right decision as possible. So I'm going to look quickly at needs. When clients comes to you, they all have different needs. And when you look at the different target groups or different specific group, you can't give the same apply the same counseling skills like what you apply to children. So children, adolescents, and other high-risk groups are different groups, and you have to adjust when it comes to this different group. Of course, when you look at children are very vulnerable. How you counsel children, it's totally different how you will counsel adolescents or young people. Sex workers that are coming, how are you going to apply your counseling skills when it comes to a sex worker, and also to a rape victim. So it's very important that as a counselor, you have to know and understand the needs of your client when you're going to offer counseling. Very important, you have to identify who are the vulnerable groups. And then when you identify who are the vulnerable groups, then you have to apply to their specific needs. And then also important is then you have to make sure that if you apply addressing the needs, then you need to have different strategies. Very important that you have to look at different psychological theories, how you apply different skills because of the situation, the physical status. And then it's very important that counseling is an ongoing experience. So you have to make sure it's not just a one-time experience. You have to work a journey with the client, which is very important. So the last section is to look at the community. Psychological counseling is at the heart of the community. You have to understand the community. You have to understand what are the needs of the community. You have to understand what are the challenges of the community. And HIV/AIDS is one of the biggest challenges. Now, when you are going to apply psychological counseling to client, it's very important that you have to look at how are you going to reach the community, and this is where you can also use, for example, the approach of peer counseling, where you have peers in one group, and one peer is going to give a counseling to other, and also peer education, where you can train community as peer counselors and peer educators, so that you can address the issue of HIV/AIDS. Then the other aspects is stigma and discrimination in the household and in community, and psychological counseling can play a very important role, and this will actually also prepare the community to become actively involved and participate in the project, and then also become peer counselors themselves, so that they can provide counseling service to their fellow community members. Once you have that, it's important to have a plan of action where you mobilize the community, so that the community can also become involved in peer counseling. So thank you for listening to me. I will then recommend that you will read your IOL study manual for more information, and I hope that you will be ready for your assignments and then also for your exams.